there can be talks on a just and lasting peace. It comes after Donald Trump held a 2-hour phone call with Putin yesterday. The Times' Washington correspondent Alistair Dorber says the US president is getting tired with both sides.
At the moment, he's not entirely on board with the Ukrainian position in a way that perhaps Joe Biden and the European leaders are. But I think there's a sense of frustration in Washington that Donald Trump's personal overtures to Vladimir Putin haven't worked, and that Vladimir Putin is still sticking to the lines that he was when Joe Biden was in office, that Russia wants these so-called security guarantees.
Sir Keir Starmer has again insisted Britain is back on the world stage after striking deals with the EU, the US and India. Speaking in the Commons, the Prime Minister said the EU agreement gives the UK the best access of any country outside the bloc to its markets.
The principles we took into the negotiations are clear and simple. Does it drive down bills? Does it drive up jobs? Does it strengthen our borders? And in each case, the answer is resoundingly yes.
The Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch branded the PM's remarks a lot of spin to disguise the terrible substance of the deals, describing the agreement with Brussels as pitiful. A coroner's found an 11-year-old girl was unlawfully killed when she drowned during a birthday party at a water park in Berkshire in August 2022. Heidi Connor also concluded there were gross breaches of health and safety measures at Liquid Leisure in Windsor, which contributed to Kyra Hill's death. She'd been in a designated swimming area, her father, Leonard Hills, demanding a change in regulations.
We must act today for Kyra and for every family that visits these leisure parks tomorrow. The time for words has passed. Now is the moment for action. Urgent, bold, unwavering. The safety of our children, the trust of our families, and the future of our summer days depend.
And an Egyptian man who arrived in the UK by small boat has been jailed after helping smugglers bring thousands of migrants across the Mediterranean Sea. Ahmed Ibid has been sentenced to 25 years. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on the Times Radio app.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
Pienaar Friends on Times Radio with NatWest Cushion.
It is good to have you with us on Pienaar Friends and our good conversation in very, very good company, which tonight is Rachel Cunliffe, the Associate Editor at the new Statesman. Hello, Rachel.
Hello. Good
to see you. And Adam Boulton, our very own, is here too. Good to see you.
Hello.
And we are live streaming on YouTube. If you want to watch us as well as listen to us, recommend whichever way you want to engage, do. And especially join in. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times, maybe a tweet to @Times Radio, or your own voice on WhatsApp, a voice note, 0333 003 2353. First then, Rachel, tell us your thought for the day.
Okay, a bit of a technical one from me today. So I interviewed Darren Hughes, who is the head of the Electoral Reform Society, which is a not-for-profit group that is campaigning to change Britain's voting system from first past the post to some form of proportional representation. And I know what you're thinking, John. We've been having this debate for decades, and we had a referendum in 2011, and it lost, and this never goes anywhere. But there were a couple of trends that have become apparent recently from the general election, from the local election, from some of the polls that we've been seeing, which do suggest that the UK electorate is fracturing way beyond a point where a voting system that is primarily about two parties can really be seen to be fit for purpose. And the general election in July was the least, well, the outcome, the parliament that we got was the least reflective of how people actually voted. So in history, it's the one that least represents how people voted. In the local elections at the start of this month, for the first time ever, 5 parties got over 10%. So that's obviously Labour, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, Reform, and even the Greens got there. You've got Reform surging ahead. You've got the two main parties, not just below 50%, but below 40% combined. And the message I got from him was, look, people are already voting as if we have proportional representation. We just don't have a system that matches that. And I think this is going to become a much bigger conversation this year because traditionally it's seen as a pet project of the Lib Dems, or at least of the left in general. But actually, Reform are disadvantaged by the voting system, or at least they were in July. Whether or not they will be in the next election remains to be seen. And really interestingly, if if we'd had some kind of proportional representation for the last election, the Conservatives would have ended up with more MPs. So the Conservatives are also disadvantaged by this. Yeah. And I think there are some really interesting numbers there. You can read my interview on the New Statesman, but it's a conversation that I think we're going to keep having.
Yeah, and the case for proportional representation in some form has been, to those who are open to the idea, it's been persuasive for all of those years. And in all of that time, and I remember general elections where we talked about with 5 horses seemed to be in the race at one point, or the order of the runners were upside down for a 2 weeks out of a 4 weeks campaign, all that sort of stuff. But then you thought, who's going to actually do it? When's it going to recommend itself to the party that's going to come out on top with the power to do anything about it? Or maybe that's changed. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Rachel, but I have to say dream on. I don't think it's going to happen, first of all, because I don't think there's any appetite from Westminster for large-scale electoral reform.
You mean the government when you say that?
Well, no, I mean collectively. I mean MPs on both sides. I don't think
Reform obviously like the idea, don't they?
Well, they like the idea, but do they actually really want to spend a lot of time on this matter? Do they want to go back to their electorate and say, forget about the cost of living, we're going to tinker around with the electoral system? The answer is they don't, and the same applies to reform of the House of Lords. So that's the first reason. The second reason is I don't see what any obvious gain there would be from having a more representative system. I mean, all it would do that, when a party like the SDP or the Reform Party surges, that they would get a foothold, which would be more difficult to dislodge going forward. You would always end up with coalition governments, which I don't think would necessarily be any particular advantage. And finally, I do think that this is going to happen increasingly in local government. I think one of the things that the Conservatives misfired on, in fact, Jacob Rees-Mogg admitted it was an own goal, was changing the way that mayors were chosen to first past the post, which was clearly ludicrous and has probably resulted in reformed mayors. If you'd had a transferable vote system, you wouldn't have necessarily had so many people from reform winning. But I think that will probably be progressively restored as we get these new members. So I think that there will be a reflection in local government. I cannot see it changing at national level, particularly if people think they need to have a referendum to do it, because, you and I remember covering that last referendum, and the level of public interest was zero.
No, it was. Are you an advocate of that cause?
I'm an advocate of the conversation. So I voted in that referendum and I voted to keep first past the post. But the more I look at trust in politics, sort of public faith in politics, and the more I speak to people who are in constituencies where they don't feel that their vote counts because it's very obvious who's going to win, or they don't even get any leaflets, no one sort of comes round, and they don't feel represented, I wonder if a system that comes up with a parliament that better reflects how people actually vote might be beneficial for trust in politics. And in terms of is there appetite for it, I completely take the point that cost of living, NHS, there are lots and lots of issues that are more relevant to people's day-to-day lives, but there is appetite among MPs. In December there was a vote, a 10-minute rule motion, which isn't going to go anywhere, but put forward by a Lib Dem MP, and it actually passed, and that was the first time in our history that Westminster has gone, we do want to talk about this. So I don't think the conversation's going away. Yeah,
I mean, the counter-argument to that is that, well, absolutely right, a lot of people will think their vote doesn't count for all sorts of reasons. If you go down the PR route and you end up almost certainly with some sort of coalition, well, then even within the governing bloc, the governing coalition, it's trade-offs. It is horse trading. And so even more people feel they haven't got what they voted for because it's been part of a bargaining process.
But I don't get the fear of coalitions as much as perhaps other people might, because in the last sort of 14 years, the only government where the same Prime Minister lasted the entire parliamentary term was the coalition one. And I personally remember that time as an era of relative stability.
So
but maybe that was youth and naivety.
And also, dare I say it, there is the constituency link. Which any PR system will loosen the connection between the MP.
You can try and keep a balance, as in the Scottish Parliament, can't you?
You can try and keep it, but it does mean that some MPs don't. There are different sorts of MPs, and they don't all have a connection to the constituency. And these days, whatever party they come from, most MPs say the most important thing they do is serve their local constituents.
Yeah. What's your thought for the day, Adam?
My thought for the day, I almost apologise for raising this, but my thought for the day is Brexit is finally over. I mean, I've been listening to the reaction, or rather the lack of reaction, to the deal done yesterday, and it seems to me that the nation has reached a settled position, which is that we're not going back, but we probably want to have closer practical relationships with the EU. And therefore, I think the whole matter has lost its political salience. I think, interestingly, Nigel Farage and Reform have moved on and are now campaigning on a much broader set of issues of social discontent, which therefore, makes me think that, Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives are absolutely bonkers to keep on banging on about this and talking about surrender and all that. It just, with all due respect to the Sun, stitched up like a kipper, it just looks like yesterday's papers and fish and chip wrapping, and I just don't think it's got an issue that's going to move the public, however much anger people try and pump into it on either side. So my message to all politicians of all kinds is move on from this one. It's over, thank goodness.
Well, we're going to talk to a pollster a bit later on in the programme. We can get some of the data to back up that.
The Tories in fourth place.
That thought. Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, sitting here, I have been struck by the same thought. Watching, seems to me, the Conservatives fighting the last war.
Even the Times leader calls it a stale debate today. Yeah. And
then you look at the data on why people went Reform in the local elections. It wasn't about Europe. I mean, there was a certain amount of migration, and a good deal of give the Labour government a good kicking. But that sort of Brexit feeling. Look at the other polls. It's just not a hot button issue. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Interesting to get the pollsters' view on that. Meanwhile, in a moment, I want to talk about the big action at Westminster. Well, not just Westminster, around the free world today. Sanctions against Israel, action against Russia. Why are we here? Where's it going to go? Let's talk about it. This is Pienaar Friends on Times Radio in association with NatWest Cushion, making.
On Times Radio with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
And Rachel Cunliffe from the Statesman and Adam Boulton are here with us. Let's talk about, lots been happening today. Britain suspending free trade talks with Israel, calling on the leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to end the blockade on Gaza. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, made a statement in the House setting out the government position.
As the Prime Minister and fellow leaders said yesterday, we cannot stand by in the face of this new deterioration. It is incompatible with the principles that underpin our bilateral relationship. rejected by members across this House, and frankly, it's an affront to the values of the British people. Therefore, today, I'm announcing that we have suspended negotiations with this Israeli government on a new free trade agreement.
Strong words from the Foreign Secretary. I spoke to Elon Levy, who was a spokesperson for the Israeli government. He had this to say.
Hamas has praised Britain for its recent statements, and I hope that praise from a terrorist regime forces the Starmer government to have a little bit of food for thought about what they've done. Britain decided a long time ago that it's happy for this war to end with Hamas in power, and I think it's shameful that it is using its diplomatic leverage essentially to shield Hamas from the consequences of the war it started. I'm sure that's not the intent, but that's the effect. And that's why Hamas is saying, bravo, Britain.
Well, I spoke to a former British diplomat, Jeremy Greenstock, who was the former British ambassador to the UN, and he felt this was significant stuff.
Well, the value of Britain's intervention, I think, particularly because it's Britain who's been so supportive of Israel over the years and the decades, that should bring home to the Israeli people that they are losing friends who really matter to them. And I think some of this debate is getting sharper in America also. So if Israelis are saying this and Israel's close friends in the West are saying this, then I think it's time for the Israeli government to take proper notice of what they're actually doing to Israel's long-term strategic interests.
So Adam and Rachel, Adam, what did you think when this stuff was announced?
Well, I do think it's a significant move, and it appears that it's part of a concerted process along with France and Canada, with the United States, more quietly, certainly not opposing condemnation of what Israel is doing now. We know J.D. Vance has cancelled a visit. So it is a significant indication of, I think, the pretty universally felt revulsion at what has happened in Gaza, not just the 50,000 people who've been killed, but in particular the blockade of aid and food over the past month. I think that the statement to the United Nations Security Council by the former British diplomat Tom Fletcher really outlining what is going on and saying this is happening on your watch, has influenced world opinion, because, as he said himself, his organisation for the UN has the only independent eyes on what's going on. And also, crucially, and perhaps highlighted by your conversation with the Israeli spokesman, is the fact that it's clearly not working. I mean, they have, if their objective is to defeat Hamas, they have not defeated Hamas. And therefore, the rest of the world is now saying, well, what's the point of this? I think the downsides are that what the British government has done is clearly not enough for the majority of Labour MPs, and they were making that viewpoint felt that they want recognition of Palestine, they want a full stop, a full arms embargo, and things like that. So politically, it's not really going to make things a lot easier, I think, for the government. And also the real downside to me is I just can't see how this ends anymore. I mean, unless there's going to be a massive concerted global intervention to reconstruct not just the Palestinians in Gaza, but the idea of a Palestinian state, it may be in the end, however brutal, the Israeli action is going to succeed, if not defeating Hamas, in at least displacing Palestinians from Gaza.
Yeah, when you say at least, I mean, Smotrich, the finance minister of Israel, was extraordinarily blunt about that. He's Bezalel Smotrich. He gave this understanding. I know he is on the sort of extreme end of the Netanyahu cabinet, and there are shades of opinion inside that cabinet, even though it's a pretty hardline government. This, though, is what the finance minister had to say.
The population will reach the south of the Strip, and from there, with God's help, move to third countries under President Trump's plan. This is a change in the course of history, nothing less.
It was a recipe for ethnic cleansing, Rachel.
That is essentially what he said, yes. And as you say, he is really on the hard line of the Netanyahu government. But I don't think it's possible to look at what the Israeli government has been doing in recent months and come to any other conclusion that is the end point. Now, in terms of what the rest of the world can do, I'm kind of with Adam on feeling a sense of despair and despondency. Listening to David Lammy in the comments today, I mean, David Lammy and I probably came at this issue a year and a half ago from really quite different perspectives, but he called it intolerable and abominable, and it's really very difficult for me to think of anything to say in contradiction to that. And actually, the Conservative response from Priti Patel didn't really contradict it in any way. Her comments were about how the UK could ensure that aid got into Gaza quicker, which is, again, a very different stance than you might imagine the Conservatives taking a year and a half ago.
It didn't make a great amount of sense, though, even so. And I heard Priti Patel on one or two interviews this morning, really having a good go at the British government for not doing more to get aid into Gaza. I mean, how is the question where that's concerned? I mean, you can talk, Britain can talk to the United Nations and offer whatever support and help it can, but at the moment there's a blockade and it's not being allowed through. And the few trucks carrying aid that are being carried in, well, they've been described by the UN as a drop in the ocean.
Yeah,
I don't quite see how does this party political difference over this even work?
So I think the Conservative strategy here is to hammer home the fractures within the Labour Party, because, as Adam said, there are a good many Labour MPs, certainly a lot of Labour members and Labour constituents, who don't believe that this goes nearly far enough, and they want to exacerbate those differences by saying, well, you're the government, why aren't you doing more? But as you say, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, and it doesn't really add to the international conversation in any way whatsoever.
I do think it's significant, though, that it's come from Priti Patel, because if we remember the history of Priti Patel, she actually lost her position in the cabinet because she appeared to be constructing an independent relationship with prominent right-wing politicians in Israel, including Netanyahu. And I think the fact that she wants to speak out on this against the consequences of the Israeli action just shows how widespread, really.
She didn't go so far as to criticise, very directly the Netanyahu government or the things we've been talking about here.
No, she didn't pick on them, but nonetheless she's criticising the effect of their actions, and that is, for her personally as a extreme right winger within the Conservative Party is quite significant.
Oh, your point about what on earth is the solution to this? That's where the conversation starts to fall silent. I mean, we had Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, speaking a little bit earlier on in Washington. He had this to say: seemed to believe the situation in Gaza would improve.
We were pleased to see that aid is starting to flow in again. I understand your point that it's not in sufficient amounts, but we were pleased to see that decision was made. I understand another 100 trucks are behind that and maybe more in the next few days. I'll also tell you that I met in Rome 3 days ago, with the World Food Program to walk through some of the ideas and plans they had for distribution on the ground. And ultimately, the answer here is for this to end, hopefully with the elimination of Hamas, because the people of Gaza deserve a more prosperous, peaceful future, which they'll never have as long as Hamas exists.
That's Marco Rubio speaking on Capitol Hill a little bit earlier on. Of course, the power that can make a difference in this is the US administration.
Yes, and the other sort of silent power, if you like, is the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia and Egypt. I mean, if they chose to say that this has gone too far and we are going to, engage in hostilities with Israel, I mean, that would be a global conflagration, but it's something that they do have it in their power to do. I think it's really interesting what is happening with Trump's foreign policy generally. I think we're seeing it to a certain extent in Ukraine as well, which is that the kind of MAGA, who cares about the rest of the world, we're the big guys, we can impose settlements. They've just come up against the limits of that, and they're beginning to realise that, more conventional lines of diplomacy, including American diplomacy, are probably where they're going to end up. And certainly Marco Rubio is on the soft wing, if you like, of the Trump administration's fresh approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, just this is a line literally just dropping at him as you speak there. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has ordered the return of a delegation that was holding Gaza ceasefire talks in Qatar, though a small team will remain in Doha. Israeli media reporting this as pretty much as we speak. Now, what does that mean? Is Benjamin Netanyahu digging in even more deeply Well, we'll see. In which case, if that's the case, and I don't know precisely what that means, but you'll draw some conclusions, then Lammy's talk, looking at it from the British lens, Lammy's talk of more action is going to be called upon very, very, very soon. Anyway, more on this. Adam, something more?
Yeah, although the British have made it clear that any moves, for example, towards recognising the Palestinian state, which to me would seem a futile gesture at this point, will be concerted with other countries.
Sure.
And I think there's a meeting in June that the French are convening where it's expected there could be a concerted kind of response to what's going on. But that's
so academic at this point.
But that, of course, would be too late.
Yeah. Okay. More coming up here on Pienaar Friends with Rachel Cunliffe, Adam Boulton and me, John Pienaar. Now it's 6:30. Here's the news with James Kitchen.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. The UK suspended trade talks with Israel over its conduct in the war in Gaza. Foreign Secretary David Lammy says there's been a humanitarian catastrophe in the Strip, including an 11-week blockade on aid. Israel's foreign ministry has called the reaction regrettable and accused critics of being driven by an anti-Israel obsession. Juliette Toomer is the communications director at UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees.
It's a catastrophe that keeps getting worse and worse by the hour. Babies are starving. Some people have died due to hunger, among them toddlers. There must be more that's done, and there must be more aid to come into Gaza, 500, 600 trucks a day at the minimum.
The UK and EU have placed fresh sanctions on Russia's military, energy and financial sectors. The Foreign Office has accused the Kremlin of repeatedly firing missiles into civilian areas of Ukraine. The father of an 11-year-old girl who drowned at a water park in Berkshire in 2022 is calling for safer standards. A coroner ruled there were gross breaches of health and safety measures which contributed to Cara Hill's death. And the Princess of Wales has made a surprise appearance at Buckingham Palace, joining Prince William at her first royal garden party in 2 years. The Prince of Wales has been hosting the traditional gathering on behalf of the King. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
Since you ask, I share that with you with a certain amount of relish.
When I spoke to you on Sunday morning on Times Radio Breakfast, you were wearing that shirt.
I put that on for you. I was popping up on your show in video, so I wore this shirt out of respect. And
I love the fan on the TV who has a properly cut suit in the colours, including a waistcoat and a tie.
Cool.
I think you've got to get one of those.
That is cool.
I mean, it wouldn't be extraordinary to have a lucky shirt, would it, John? I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd worn that on Saturday during the final itself and then been continuing to wear it, especially for tonight where you're hoping for another win. So I wouldn't have mocked you if you hadn't washed it.
It wouldn't have occurred to me to worry about whether you were mocking me or not. That was an act of faith and it is against an act of celebration, of solidarity.
Absolutely. Okay, this evening we're going to continue the discussion around what is the appropriate action to take against Israel. Are we too light of foot with what we've announced today? Should we be going further? We'll be speaking to the former Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind about that, and also to an orthopaedic surgeon, Graham Groom, who's been volunteering in Gaza. He's in Khan Yunis at the moment. He's been evacuated from the hospital where he has been acting out surgical procedures on people who are desperately in need. And for him, it has got personal. He's very careful with what he says, Graham Groom. He is a humanitarian doctor. But for him, enough is enough, I think it's fair to say. So we'll speak to him a little bit later on. We'll also be speaking to David Satterfield as well, former US envoy for humanitarian issues in the Middle East. A story from Larissa Brown that will arrive on thetimes.com very soon concerns Donald Trump's administration's thoughts on Britain and the amount it is prepared to spend on defence. There is a commonality of feeling amongst those in Donald Trump's administration as to how far Britain should be going on their defence spending. And Larissa is reporting on that exclusively for The Times. Won't say any more about that. You can discover and learn more about that during the show. We'll also talk about Russian disinformation as well. And there's been a meeting today of Ukraine's Foreign Policy Committee with a group of MPs chaired by Emily Thornberry. And I know that you'll be hearing from Emily, I think, on tomorrow's show. But we're going to start to dig into what we heard during this joint session, Ukraine and the UK's Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee, who are accusing the American administration of believing Russian disinformation, of being too quick to subscribe to it, specifically Steve Witkoff, one of Trump's envoys, of course, on this area. We'll dig into that with one of the people who is on the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. We'll be speaking to Richard Ford, the Lib Dem politician, former British Army officer as well. There's a lot to discuss. We'll talk about the future of the Conservative Party and where they go now after that polling that you've been talking about, John. They're in fourth. And we'll speak to Sonia Soda as well, formerly of The Observer and The Guardian. She's written a piece in tomorrow's paper about where we are now after that Supreme Court decision in the eyes of equality law as to what constitutes a woman. And she sort of charts where we've got to right now as we understand that it's not as simple as a Supreme Court ruling, no matter how clear it was.
All right, loads there with the UK. Looking forward to that. 7 o'clock right after this show. Now, here on Pienaar Friends, Adam Boulton's here, Rachel Cunliffe is here, as I say, and we've been joined on the line from our Washington correspondent for The Times, Alistair Dorber. Hi to you, Alistair.
Hi, John.
Hi, great to have you here, Alistair. I mean, just your thoughts on the way, well, we've been talking today pretty intensely about action being taken on a pretty broad front when it comes to Israel and Russia. In the case of Israel, we've seen the British government, well, calling off trade talks, suspending trade talks and threatening sanctions if the blockade of Gaza is not ended by the Netanyahu Israeli government. Same time, action taken against Russia. All of this, as things stand, pretty much in the absence of America. How does this flurry of activity on both these fronts look from Washington through their lens?
I think the Americans are on both issues, both on Russia and on Israel and Gaza. They're getting increasingly frustrated. We heard from Trump before he came back into office that the Ukraine war will be settled within 24 hours. Clearly, the call yesterday between Trump and Putin demonstrates, if nothing else, that that's just not going to happen. And we know it's not going to happen in 24 hours, but it's not an easy not an easy thing to solve. And I think there's just a growing frustration here in the US with both conflicts, with people that the administration needs to rely on to help Putin to end the war and Netanyahu to end the war in Israel. They're just not getting from these discussions they're having any tangible results. Yes. And the sense, certainly in the White House and Donald Trump, it's the frustration is palpable. Whether they would welcome the Europeans taking a more active role, certainly when it comes to Ukraine, I think that's certainly true. But I think there's a growing sense in Washington that these conflicts are possibly intractable, and it's very difficult for them, I think, at the moment to find a way out of both of them.
Yeah, I mean, when we hear it argued, I mean, William Hague, of course, the former British Conservative Foreign Secretary, was really persuasively arguing something which I think will have run through many, many minds, which is that Donald Trump's being played by Putin like a violin. And I suppose they accept that in the White House. What do they say about that argument? Because he certainly seems to be accepting and parroting and echoing every line that comes out of the Kremlin. And what more can Zelensky do? How does the White House answer those when you have that conversation?
Well, look, you've got the Ukrainians, you've got the Europeans, you've got the Americans, all calling for 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. The only roadblock to that is Vladimir Putin in Moscow. He has a list of demands. He said, yes, I want peace. And that's what Donald Trump comes out of these calls with. He says, I've spoken to Vladimir Putin and he wants peace. Yeah. But there's a great big asterisk, which is, I want peace with no NATO troops in Ukraine. No chance of Ukraine ever joining NATO, territorial gains. And so, as Putin says, our reasons for attacking Ukraine in the first place are upheld and secured. Donald Trump realizes that he's not getting from the Russians what he needs to get from the Russians, but he's also got to spin a line to suggest that he's making progress. He's got threats. He's threatening that the Americans will walk away from peace talks. I think that's unlikely. But he knows that Putin holds all the cards at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, he could apply more pressure. I mean, he's maybe the only single player who could apply pressure with effect. And there's a good reason to think that Putin would be rather worried about that, even rather scared about that. So we watch and we wait for Donald Trump to make a move if he's ever going to make one. Rachel and Adam are here.
I'm with William Hague here on the Trump White House being, what was it, played like a violin?
Played like a violin.
By Putin. And we've actually, we've seen this happen. We've seen the series of phone calls between Trump and Putin where Trump gives more and more away, and obviously it's not his to give, it's Ukraine's to give, but pressures Zelensky into giving more and more away and makes these statements like Russia has all the cards, Ukraine has none of the cards, and then acts surprised when Putin decides that he'll sit back and see what else he can get out of the White House, which is now exactly what's going on. And I wonder if, rather than it being anything to do with ideology, the lack of diplomatic experience in the White House from both Trump and his team, the lack of knowledge of the very complex history and geopolitical dynamics at play, what is it that actually started this conflict? When did it go back to? How does Russia view those territories? What happened in the mid-20th century to change all of that? They don't have a grasp of history that will help them understand what the flashpoints are, and they have this really quite arrogant approach, which is, we're America, we're the greatest country, the wealthiest country, the strongest military force in the world, therefore we'll just tell Putin what to do. And running up against the realities of that is proving quite humiliating for them.
I guess there's ignorance and there's also indifference, and sometimes they just
sometimes they're the same thing
in an unhelpful way. What's your take on what Rachel thinks there, Alistair?
I think that's true. I mean, Vladimir Putin really hasn't changed his position much in 3 years. Yes, he said he would turn up. He offered some face-to-face talks, which he then reneged on. But Vladimir Putin's position has been pretty much the same since the start of the war, which is, I don't want NATO on my western borders, and he believes that part of Ukrainian territory should be Russian. And he invaded. And various, the Biden administration made very little progress. The Trump administration has made less progress. I entirely agree with the idea that there's the lack of diplomatic experience in the White House right now hasn't helped the Americans. I think the Trump administration came into office and thought, well, we'll threaten, we'll cajole, we'll talk about trade, we'll talk about lifting sanctions, we'll talk about renewed economic ties. And Vladimir Putin has said yes and no at the same time, played the time, continued the war, and at the same time has left, I think, Donald Trump and his team sitting looking a little bit silly. I mean, you look at who the Americans have brought in on these negotiations. Marco Rubio is a very experienced foreign policy expert, if you like, now Secretary of State. he's got very little knowledge of Russia and Ukraine. And then Steve Witkoff, who is actually the Middle East envoy, has played a leading role in the negotiations with Moscow. I mean, he's a real estate developer. Yes. He's a guy that does deals. He can sort of cut a loan for less money, or build a higher building than you were hoping to do, and get through planning laws. And he's not someone who's got great diplomatic experience.
No, so there's lots of ignorance, but also I mentioned indifference, maybe just as powerful an influence. I mentioned earlier on a couple of times in the course of the day a really clear argument set out in the Wall Street Journal today about what was basically set out as the Trump doctrine, which is to make money for America, skim off a few millions and billions for himself, and the idea of ideology and common values shared with allies. It is simply of no interest and no concern to Donald Trump now, which leaves those former allies able to do things for themselves. And it tells us the world, it's a very different world now.
I think there's a positive factor about Donald Trump that's perhaps missing from that analysis, which is I genuinely think he is conflict averse. And I think if you look at his, rantings on Truth Social, it always comes back to bloodbaths and the number of people who are being killed. And I think he genuinely, while I accept the sort of acquisitive nature of his foreign policy, I think he genuinely felt that as the most powerful man in the world, he was in the position to end bad things happening, as he would probably put it. But the problem he's experiencing is that is simplistic.
Yes.
So he's done the deal, if you like, in Ukraine, but he hasn't stopped the war.
Yeah.
And what he's really come up against in both these situations, in both Russia and in Israel, is a strongman leader who he feels some fellow creature identity with. But the big difference is those strongman leaders is they don't care about bloodshed.
Yeah.
And also they need, when you're talking about Netanyahu or you're talking about Putin, they need to continue this war in their own selfish interest. Because if Putin stops the war and says, well, I haven't really won very much, but sorry about the million people who've been killed, he's not going to be in a strong position to hang on to power. Likewise, as we all know, Netanyahu is holding off prosecutions and the end of his premiership. So we've got a peace-loving strong man against two strong men who are war-loving.
Yeah, conflict averse is, if you like, the other side of a coin. The other side of the coin just says isolationist, and being conflict averse doesn't necessarily mean averse to someone else carrying on a conflict. In this case, Vladimir Putin. And yesterday there was Trump saying this was Europe's war, not ours. Why are we worried about it?
Well, yeah, but there's equally he has said repeatedly, albeit in vain, this must stop.
Yeah, until he walks away, which he also says he might do.
Well, I think he would be walking away because he had failed in stopping it. It doesn't mean that he wouldn't regret that conflict was still going on,
or that he could have done more to bring about a peace on the terms somewhere resembling justice, to put pressure on Putin.
Yeah, but if you think about it, his position on Ukraine is exactly the same position as ours on Gaza and the Middle East, i.e., you come around to decrying what's going on, but you're not prepared to take a risk and to really get the leverage against the aggressors.
Yeah, look, we could go on with this for some time. Trump has a power in Ukraine that we do not have in Gaza. But you can argue this in different ways, and we could go on with that for some time. Right now, I do have to say good evening and goodbye for now to Alistair Dorber. Alistair, thanks for joining us. Let's hope we can talk again very soon. This is, of course, Pienaar Friends on Times Radio in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees
customers happier. All built into a single platform you can use right now. That's why the world works with ServiceNow. Visit servicenow.com/UK/AI for people.
There's not many things as epic as jumping over a volcano in a...
Now, let's talk then about the latest opinion polling. It shows the Conservatives falling behind the Liberal Democrats in the polls. First time that's happened for more than 6 years. We're talking about a YouGov poll here. This poll, again, it shows Reform UK ahead of all the other parties, this time on 29%. That's not a bad place to be if you are Reform UK. Joe Twyman's here, the co-founder and director at Delta Poll. Hello to you, Joe. Hello, Joe Twyman. Are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
I
can hear you.
Yeah, I've got you, Joe. Good to have you here. So, look, I mean, first of all, just these numbers, Reform out there stretching a bit of a lead, and the Lib Dems overhauling the Tories. So many straws, fascinating straws, and so many wins.
Yes, that's right. Although it's worth pointing out, of course, that this is only one poll. But it's one poll that continues trends that we've seen really since the local election. The same company that produced this poll at the beginning of May produced another poll that showed basically the same result, exactly the same result for Labour, Reform and the Greens, and the Conservatives and Lib Dems have just swapped by 1 percentage point. So it's very much within the margin of error. But what these polls have shown consistently is a long-term trend that is certainly favourable for Reform, even if they haven't succeeded in growing their gap since the local election boost that they received. At the same time, the Conservatives have gradually, slowly, but consistently fallen back in the polls, while the Lib Dems, similarly slowly, have increased their position. So I think, in many ways, it was inevitable that we were going to see this at some point. The question now is, where do things go? How far can the Conservatives fall? How high can Reform go? We don't really know.
Yeah, Rachel Cunliffe's had her head buried in this data, haven't you, Rachel?
Oh, there's so many interesting things about this poll. And I know it's a poll 10 months out from a general election and we shouldn't read too much into it, etc., but we're all going to. So a couple of things that stood out to me. One is that... yes, the Conservatives are the big story here because they've gone down to fourth place. They were in fourth place in 2019 with the Brexit Party briefly, and then Boris Johnson led the revival. But it's not great news for Labour either. And I think if you add up the Labour and the Conservative vote share in this poll, you get to 38%, which is significantly less than half. So that's the majority of people picking a party other than the two parties that have led this country for the last century. And I just wondered, Joe, with your polling analysis hat on, is that sustainable? Have you seen anything like that before?
No, not failure to this extent for the two main parties. We have seen other parties do particularly well. In 1981, for instance, the SDP Liberal Alliance were on more than 50% in a couple of polls. But look what happened to them. 9 years later, the SDP lost to the monster raving loony party in a by-election. So you can't take anything for granted. But the situation is very different now. And I think the point that you've made about that 38% for the government and the opposition combined is really interesting and reflective of the fact that we're increasingly not talking about Conservative versus Labour, left versus right. We're talking about a considerable proportion of the electorate who are dissatisfied, distrusting and disapproving, not just of individual political parties or politicians, but of the political system in general. And Reform, and before them the Brexit Party and UKIP, they didn't create this wave. It's been building for 10, 20, 30 years, depending on when you want to start. But they've been very effective, particularly this time, at riding it into the beach. The question is for how long they'll be able to sustain this, because when it comes to a general election, we know, for instance, that the important subjects are things like the economy, which is still way ahead on people's most important issue list, and the NHS. And on both those things, it's not strong ground for reform. So to move from a party that is picking up votes against other parties to be a part of a serious political force that people are voting for is a transition they may struggle with.
Yeah, you've got to wonder, is Reform UK peaking too early, I guess?
Well, that was going to be my next question for Joe, and I'm not sure it's something that you can really pick up in polls like this far out from when people are actually voting. But in the last election, we saw a concerted anti-conservative vote where people looking at their constituencies and going, who should I vote for to have the most chance of voting the Tories out? Is it possible that we could see, or are we already seeing signs of an anti-reform backlash, as it were, where people start to see reform as a genuine threat and then change their vote accordingly?
Well, that's a really good question. And if the last 10 or 15 years in British politics have taught us anything, it's that nothing can be ruled out. But with 4 years to go until a general election, you can make very good arguments for this outcome or that outcome, this to happen or that to happen. And you can speculate, but it is nothing more than that, simply speculation. We don't know because there are so many things going on here. You're right, there may now be an anti-reform backlash, but we don't know. It may be the case that reform are now subjected to the kind of scrutiny that they're not used to. And the strength in depth that consistently they have lacked up until this point may come back to haunt them. Because if there's one thing that has been consistent in the, if you like, Farage and Farage adjacent political movements over the last couple of decades, it's that they rely on him.
Where would we
beyond
be?
him, yes, they have some people, but they sometimes struggle to be consistent and to stay on message, and indeed to maintain party discipline. Just look what happened with Rupert Lowe in the first 10 months of this Parliament.
Yeah, let's not knock speculation. Without it, this show would have to shut up shop. Adam,
I mean, I have to say, I don't know whether you agree. I think the most interesting result is the one about the Conservatives now dropping into fourth place. And I just wonder, if you take the general election and the decline since the general election, is there a real possibility now of the Conservative Party effectively declining into irrelevance as, you know, the people who used to vote for it move either towards the Lib Dems or towards reform?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a possibility. The Conservatives may find that the sort of, if you like, the public opinion death spiral that they found themselves in towards the end of Rishi Sunak's time in Downing Street, where basically it didn't matter what they said, it didn't matter what policies they released or what they talked up, they just couldn't buy a vote. Not that I'm suggesting they were trying to buy votes. But it's an example of the kind of situation you can get in where really it doesn't matter what happens. You just keep falling away because people find alternatives and people actively seek out alternatives. The question then is, how low can the Conservatives fall? They're in 16% in this poll. When they get to 15%, 14%, will they get to 10%? The question then arises, particularly with the party conference coming in a few months' time, how long do they stick with what they have at the moment? And I don't just mean in terms of their leader, Kemi Badenoch. I mean more widely in terms of their approach, the people they have, they have working for them, and the kind of policies they're trying to put across.
Yes.
Would another leader help them, do you think?
I think potentially it could, but the question with another leader is always, okay, firstly, who is that other leader? Who's the person standing in the wings to make a difference? The obvious suggestion there is Robert Jenrick, but would he really make a significant difference? I think he'd have to have a completely reformed, for want of a better expression, set of policies and approach to messaging. And the difficulty he may find, or indeed any new Conservative leader may find, is that, as we've seen time again over the last 2 decades, you can't out-Farage Nigel Farage. And so you may come up with policies that appeal to reform voters in your eyes as the new Conservative leader, and simply find that people say, I don't believe you, I'm sticking with reform because they're stronger on this policy.
Yeah.
I mean,
on this area.
The next big elections next year are the Scottish and Welsh elections. This is obviously a UK-wide picture, but what does polling of this kind point to in terms of the results in those elections, which could be absolutely crucial for reform?
Yeah, there's been relatively little polling in those specific areas, but what we do know is that Labour is suffering in Scotland, partly as a result of the threat of reform, but just generally because of their decline in their position nationally. That lends potentially reform an option on the sort of unionist side of things, because where they've consistently faced problems there is from the SNP. So we could see a resurgence of the SNP. And in Wales, reform are likely to do very well.
Got to leave there. Joe Twyman, thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Coming up, Kate Borsay here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have fun at Selhurst Park this evening. Good luck to Palace. What a week. It is 7 o'clock. It is the evening edition with Kate Borsay. Coming up.
We cannot stand by in the face of this new deterioration. It is incompatible with the principles that underpin